for those not too familiar with Butler, this is a Butler team that really started to a very long-standing historic program, but really started to emerge back on the national stage in the late 90s, early 2000s under Brad Stevens' flourish to back-to-back national championship games in 2010, 2011, so close in 2010 against Duke. And then, Brad left. They went to the Atlantic 10 from the Horizon League. They then made one season later, they made another jump from the Atlantic 10 to the Big East. So think about this. Guys like Rose Jones, Kellen Dunham, they were recruited to be Horizon League players, and now they've been multi-year Big East players. And so that's been a bit of a challenge as well to get the recruiting pipeline filled up. Now, they've done a great job. They've established themselves as all-conference type players. But there's been a little bit of a curve and an adjustment in there. I think the biggest thing for Butler, it depends kind of how you interpret the Butler way. I think when you think thematically, that concept of the Butler way, it's about humbling yourself. It's about playing great team basketball. It's about being a great student athlete. Those types of things. That hasn't changed a lick. Those are the same principles that you will find from the folks on the teams in the 90s to the teams when they went to the national championship game to the teams today. Those types of things haven't changed. What has changed this year really is that they've had to be a more up-tempo, offensive-minded team. Again, there's sort of a winning ugly mentality that Butler has had for years, and that goes back to those early days, but it also goes back to those national championship games when they just found a way to sort of grind out gritty wins, and they did it with savvy. They weren't the biggest players, they weren't the strongest players, but they found a way to win because of the toughness. Defensively, they still show toughness, but it's not the level of defensive intensity that they've had in years past. So they've had just from a personnel standpoint, they don't have that. So they've had to get up and down the floor a lot more. And so that's been a little bit of a change from the way that people traditionally think about Butler. But in terms of the principles and the staples of the program, those things haven't changed at all. I think the thing that jumps out to me is the balance that Texas Tech presents offensively. If you look at some of the teams in the Big East, the teams that Butler's been able to be a little successful at, it's been maybe when one or two guys have been the primary scorers for a team. And that's, I think, going to be a unique challenge. The other thing is Texas Tech gets a lot at the line, right? So you're drawing a lot of free throws. You're hitting a lot of free throws. Butler can't afford to get guys like Tyler Wideman, Andrew Schrabis, Rose Jones in foul trouble. That will really limit because of the small margin of error. So for Butler, I see a couple of the obstacles being, can you defend without fouling? Can you maintain a level of toughness but defend without fouling? And two, can you do a good enough job defensively as a team, playing Butler's team defense to take multiple people out of the offense and make it difficult for Texas Tech to get in any sort of rhythm? I think those are going to be two early keys you look at for Butler. Yeah, and it's interesting. I think one of the more overused coaches' expressions is margin of error, small margin of error, things like that. But I think it's apt this season for the Bulldogs because this is a team that's not incredibly deep. They're just going to go a couple off the bench. It's a team that started off 11-1 in non-conference play, red hot. They were in the top 10 in the country in entering the Big East play, and then really struggled. They went 3-6 through the first half of the Big East season, and part of that was this is a Butler team that for years has branded itself on what's called the Butler way, this idea of defensive toughness, mental toughness, great team basketball. And coming into the season, they knew that they were going to have to be more of an offensive-minded team. They lost a couple of their big defensive stoppers last season, so they had to kind of change their MO a little bit to score more. And in the front part of the Big East Conference slate, they stopped scoring. And when they stopped scoring and they couldn't contain teams with defensive toughness, it was a really big problem. But then what happened in the second half of the season, they got tougher, but more importantly than that, a guy by the name of Keelan Martin came alive, a rising sophomore in the Big East, and my goodness, did he have a whale of a second half. His scoring went up to almost 20 points per game in the second half of the league season, had a career high 35 points against Georgetown. And when Keelan Martin was out there as a wing player for the Bulldogs, it took more pressure off Kellen Dunham, who's one of the elite shooters in the Big East and in the country for that matter. And so if now they could sort of play off each other, you weren't getting the same lockdown defender every time on the wing for Kellen. And that opened things up offensively. The Bulldogs got back to scoring more than 80 points in their the last 9 wins they had, or seven wins they had in the last 9 conference games, I should say. And then, unfortunately for the Bulldogs, they played the first round of the Big East tournament against Providence, and everything they had worked so hard over the back half of the conference season went away, and they went back to not as tough of a team to play defensively. They made some mental mistakes, and they just couldn't contain Ben Bentel. But it's a team that I would say it's a program that's traditionally been identified as a defensive team, hard-nosed, grind it out. This year, they've become a little bit more of an offensive juggernaut, and their efficiency reflects that.